We're going to have call up Jim, the past president, to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Mike Walker. Thank you, Jim.
Our speaker this afternoon is Mike Walker, a retired Army officer. Mike joined the Army Militia in Toronto while still a high school student. After graduation, he joined the regular force and qualified as an artillery officer. He worked his way through the regimental duties and attended a long-year course, becoming an instructor in gunnery. He qualified as a paratrooper as well, following which he served several years in airborne units. Mark served in various locations across Canada, as well as 5 tours overseas, 2 in Germany, 1 each in England, Cyprus, and Croatia. I had the pleasure to serve with Mike in E-Battery Para 2 RCHA. He was very demanding. He demanded a high standard, and he led by example. Mike retired in 1999 after 36 years of service, following which he attended Algonquin College, graduating after a 3-year course as a civil and construction engineering technician. He then worked for many years, mostly as a consultant in the military domain. Mike currently serves on the board of his condominium here in Kanata. So with no further ado, may I welcome Mike, retired Lieutenant Colonel OMMCD, to make a tribute to our D-Day heroes.
Thank you, Ms. M, for your introduction. I would be most remiss if I did not mention the exemplary contribution which your past president, Jim Himlin, made to the development and training of artillery paratroopers in E-Battery Para, when we worked together from 1978 to 1980. The troops and I could not have asked for more. I would like to start my remarks with a disclaimer. I'm not an accredited historian, but I have had an interest in history all my life, and my service in the military afforded me the opportunity to meet with D-Day veterans and to discuss Canada's role. The purpose of my remarks today is to pay tribute to all who 80 years ago made the D-Day landing a success, those who sacrificed their well-being to provide a future for my generation. The best way that I feel I can do this is to highlight the extraordinary difficulties they faced. We all know how the battle turned out, so my remarks today will be to illustrate the challenges the Allied faced in preparing for this most complex operation. I want to stress the soldiers, sailors, and air personnel who were involved realized from the outset the immense challenge that lay ahead for them. And they knew that the outcome of their efforts would be anything but certain. So today, I intend to outline the challenges they faced, mention the lessons they learned from the Diaparade, consider the analysis and solution, and lastly, to mention the battle. I was most fortunate, along with thousands of other Canadian Army officers of my generation, who shared the counsel of 2 remarkable individuals, both veterans of D-Day, who made it their mission to educate us on the lessons we should learn from that operation. They were by no means singing their own praises. They would say little of what they did as individuals in the battle, but they stressed the analysis, planning, and preparation which eventually led after a difficult and bloody journey to success. The first mentor was Brigadier Stanley Todd, who was raised in Ottawa and who lived here following his service in World War I. This officer was a specialist in artillery and served in the local militia regiment through the interwar period. He volunteered at the start of World War II for active service, and in 1941 he took a reduction in rank from lieutenant colonel to major to go overseas. Once there, his abilities were soon recognized, and he was promoted and appointed the artillery commander responsible for the naval gunfire in the Canadian sector, which was Juno Beach on D-Day. The second mentor was a much younger and more junior officer, but equally remarkable, Brigadier S.B. Radley Walters, who served as a tank commander on the day. General Rad, as we respectfully spoke of him, stayed in the Army until the mid-70s, sharing his knowledge of the importance of all arms cooperation as an essential element of military success. Like Brigadier Todd, he spoke to generations of military students well after his retirement. Returning to the Second World War, it was understood following the withdrawal of British and French troops from Dunkirk in 1940 that the Allies would have to re-enter Europe if the war was to be won. First of all, of course, the Allies had to win the Battle of Britain and stall the German invasion of the UK. Thanks to the courage and tenacity of the Commonwealth Air Forces and the decision of Adolf Hitler to divert the major elements of his army and air force to the invasion of the Soviet Union, the front in the West could be classed as marginally stabilized in 1942. The planning that therefore began for offensive operation in Europe. Unfortunately for the Canadians, that involved Operation Jubilee, the attack on Dieppe, and the greatest number of casualties for the Army on any day in World War II. It immediately became apparent by the casualty count alone that the incursion had not been a success. Brigadier Todd mentioned that at once research began to figure out what had gone wrong, and more importantly, to figure out what had to be done better in the future. The first problem in doing this was that the people who could best furnish the answers were dead or casualties or prisoners of the Germans. But what had gone wrong? The conclusions reached after an extensive analysis were as follows. First of all, a fortified harbor had been attacked, giving the enemy a position of advantage. Then, naval gunfire and air bombardment had been inadequate. Third, the tanks could not get off the beach because of the round pebbles, which hindered their traction and jammed their tracks. Fourth, the seawall in front of the town posed an obstacle for both the tanks and the troops. Then surprise had been lost when part of the convoy encountered enemy forces on the route across the channel. Then it had to be appreciated that the Canadian troops lacked an essential ingredient, which was battle experience. And lastly, they needed for the operation overwhelming air support superiority and well prior to the landing. All of this was discussed with the strategic staffs, and initial plans were made for General Eisenhower and General Montgomery when they were assigned their positions of responsibility of command for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, and that occurred in November of 1943. The shortest route from Dover to Calais, about 50 kilometers, was not chosen, but rather the Allies opted for the longer route from the UK to the Normandy. It was considered that the shortest route was the most obvious, and the greater surprise could be achieved by using the longer indirect approach. 5 landing beaches were selected along the 100-kilometer front. As illustrated on this slide, the Canadians landed on a 10-kilometer strip known as Juno Beach between the 2 British beaches, Gold and Sword. Once the real plan had been made, an extensive disinformation campaign called Operation Fortitude was launched to convince the Germans that the shorter route was going to be used. This operation greatly involved the Canadians who were not landing on D-Day, and the intent being that they make the enemy mass his reserve forces in areas and positions 300 kilometers northeast of the Normandy beachhead, somewhere between the Scheldt estuary and the Pas de Calais. This ruse continued even well after D-Day. Most of the Normandy beaches was sandy in nature, and clandestine landing operations were mounted to secure soil from these areas. These samples were brought back for analysis to identify comparable beaches in the UK for testing and training purposes. The results proved that the sand was favorable to tracked vehicles, but not so much for vehicles with wheels. Hence, the Canadian Army headquarters in the UK made the decision that the artillery slated for the first landings would convert its equipment from a wheeled British gun tractor to a tracked vehicle. An American tracked gun based on the Sherman tank chassis was developed. It's called a Priest. These tractor self-propelled guns would land, cross the beach, and be in action close behind the initial waves and offer immediate support for the tanks and the infantry. Thus, in the next 4 months, 4 artillery units had to train, practice their drivers, signalers, mechanics, and artillery gunners on a very difficult set of equipment than they've been using since 1939. Following the initial landings, engineering improvements could be made so that the shore would be passable to wheeled vehicles as well. The British developed several specialized engineering vehicles to assist passage. The first is called the Crab, which is a tank with a rotating cylinder in front to which you can see chains are attached. Acting like a flail, they beat the ground and set off anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, creating a safe path for the following forces. Next was the bobbin track layer. As the large cylinder unrolled, it laid down material to create an improved roadway for the passage of wheeled vehicles. Thirdly, a ram vehicle allowed the tracked vehicles to climb the seawall and to surmount wire obstacles and ditches. Lastly was an armored engineered demolition vehicle which would fire a 44-pound explosive charge a distance of 100 meters to smash the seawall or destroy enemy pillboxes. The Air Force conducted extensive photo reconnaissance of the Normandy area, but to keep the element of surprise, their missions only represented a quarter of those shown. The remainder were flown in the Calais area and north. These photos showed various types of obstacles being built to damage or sink the landing craft, as well as the location of concrete pillboxes containing anti-tank and machine guns. We often picture these guns as pointing out to sea, but in fact, most of them were not. Except for the observation bunkers, those containing the guns were primarily aimed along the length of the beach. This allowed the enemy to engage when the landing troops were most vulnerable, at the moment of landing and immediately afterwards on the open beach, as they struggled forward with mines and other wire obstacles. The Germans built sand and concrete barriers on the sea side, which would protect the bunkers from the majority of Allied shells from that direction. Because of how the defenses were positioned, the decision was made that the tanks would be the first elements to land, so that they could engage the opening of the bunkers with direct fire at short range. It was not possible to bring the ships transporting these vehicles close to shore. Rather, a special type of Sherman tank was developed, a floating dual or duplex drive vehicle. It would be driven by 2 propellers when afloat and then transition to track propulsion when ashore. A removable wooden canvas screen was developed to encircle the tank and give it the required buoyancy and about a meter of freeboard above the water line. Then there was a question of when to land. The Navy favored the option of low tide, when the beach obstacles for their ships would be most exposed. The Army favored landing at a higher tide in order that the troops would be exposed to fire for a shorter period of time than their dash across the beach. The choice was made. The soldiers would land on the beach an hour or so after low tide, giving them a 150-meter dash or slog without cover and hindered by wire obstacles and mines. For his part, Brigadier Todd realized the limitation of his artillery resources to destroy the German concrete defenses. But from his own background and that of Dieppe, he planned to get and use the maximum number of guns available before, during, and after the assault. He was also aware that the Juno Beach area lay on the most probable approach for a German counterattack from the north, about 500 tanks. So, in addition to his 72 field artillery guns under his command, he secured an additional 88 from other British and Canadian sources, and also available to him were 11 bombardment ships from the Navy, a further 44 guns and rockets. After midnight, the Air Force bombers began their attack on long-range heavy coastal artillery, troop concentrations, as well as key railway and road infrastructure. Attacking the rail lines to isolate the battlefield was particularly important, since it was a standard German practice to conduct all movement of tanks over 80 kilometers by rail. The naval gunfire from destroyers, frigates, and battleships to engage the targets started at about 5:45 a.m. This was followed up by 96 guns of the Canadian artillery firing from their landing craft at 7 a.m. as they ran towards the beaches. These guns each fired between 100 and 150 rounds over the next 30 minutes. What did Brigadier Todd hope to accomplish by this? He realized that a 35-pound shell would have little effect on a concrete bunker. But what he did hope to accomplish was to disrupt and demoralize the defenders and their extensive horse transport through the sound and blast, especially for those soldiers and animals who had service against the Soviets and experienced their massive barrages. The Canadian tankers knew they faced a formidable foe. The range of the standard short-barreled gun on the Sherman tank was inferior to the German models, However, 25% of the Canadian tanks were hastily equipped with a long-barreled modified anti-tank gun effective to 2 kilometers, twice the range of other Allied tanks. It was called a Firefly. This would be the only tank gun which would penetrate even the frontal armor on the German tanks. These slides show the 3 types of tanks the Allies would engage in Normandy. The first is the Panzer IV, which weighed about 28 tons, Panzer V, the Panther, 45 tons, and later the Tiger, 69 tons. And the more weight, the more armor. By contrast, the Allied tanks, the Sherman, was about 32 tons. Returning to the landings, the wind was blowing at 28 kilometers an hour, and the sea swell was a meter high, a peril to the floating tanks. The plan was to have the tanks land first, but this was delayed by a critical 15 minutes because of the sea conditions. As a result, the infantry landed first with their landing craft, spread out, separated from each other by over 100 meters, the length of a football field on either side. As they neared the beach, the view of the flotilla behind them disappeared, and they felt very much alone. And the first wave of 40 tanks of the 1st Hussars was launched, and 27 landed successfully. For the other armored unit, the Fort Garry Horse, the landing ship brought them close enough to shore that the flotations were not, devices were not needed. But of the 40 tanks, only 24 made it to shore. What about the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force? Contributions to Operation Overlord. The Navy contributed over 10,000 men and 110 ships, from the size of the tribal destroyer HMCS Haida, which is now on display in Hamilton, to merchant cruisers, corvettes, minesweepers, and motor torpedo boats, 63 warships, and 46 landing craft of various sizes. The RCAF committed 39 bomber and fighter squadrons, supporting the initial bombardment, providing air cover, ground attack, and photo support. Undoubtedly, the main contribution of the RCAF and the other Allied Air Force was in totally dominating the sky and preventing the German Luftwaffe from discovering or making havoc of the mass invasion fleet. As you can well imagine, an intervention by the German Air Force would well have proved disastrous. In the end, 14,000 Canadian and 7,000 British troops landed on Juno Beach in D-Day, as well as 3,200 vehicles. None of their optimistic objectives were achieved on D-Day, but the Canadians advanced the furthest of any of the Allied forces, a remarkable feat given the fact that for all but a few of the Canadian troops had not been exposed to the final litmus test for a soldier, which is the shock, shell, and casualties of battle. On remembering the day and thinking of his responsibility towards those lost under his command, Brigadier Todd noted that Canada had lost 359 fathers, sons, brothers, and cousins of that day. A terrible loss for each family. Even the fact that it was the second lowest of the fatal losses of the other beach was not a consolation to him. The only bright aspect of those casualty figures is the fact they were significantly lower than the 2,000 anticipated before the attack, and just 10% of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which occurred a generation earlier. Brigadier Todd told me simply that it was the worst day of his life. To which I replied, yes, sir, but just think, It gave millions of oppressed people a glimmer of hope. I thank you for your attention this afternoon and for the opportunity to pay tribute to those Canadians from sea to sea to sea, military and civilian, who make our troops' success possible. I was 10 months old when the landings occurred. I didn't realize it, safe in my crib in Toronto, but I've been given an opportunity for a splendid future, and I honor them all. If you have any questions on my presentation, I would be happy to address them now or following later as they clear the dishes. Thank you.
A little token of appreciation for Mike for his well-spoken words.